So, hey everybody, so I'm Todd Zakrajsek. Thank you for joining us. And this week, I'm really excited. We have Corine Coniglio, who's at King's College, associate professor there. And the topic this week is on compassion, understanding, and empathy. Staying in balance without losing your edge. And we thought this would be a good topic to do because, well, quite frankly, everybody's a little stressed right now. And sometimes it's kind of hard to show compassion when we're stressed. And so Corine was going to talk about some of her work in this area, and she's been doing this for a lot of years, and I've known her for years. She comes to Lilly conferences, fabulous person. But basically, Corine, I'm just going to turn it over to you now. So go take it away.
Well, thank you. I appreciate being here. And like you said, the timing, I think, is good for us to think about and talk about compassion. While I bring up my slides, so maybe visually it can help you out a little bit. 2 years ago at the Lilly conference in Bethesda, Maryland, I did a workshop on compassion. And the reason I was so interested in it at the time was because I found it challenging, not because I lacked compassion, but because I didn't always practice wise compassion. And I think sometimes I got worn out and I didn't know where the boundaries were for everything. And so it turned out to be a really interesting, there was interesting participation in the workshop, ranges from people who say, hey, compassion is not a part of teaching. It is what it is. The students need to do what they do. This is not personal. To others who said, oh, it breaks my heart when I see students in certain situations and I want to be able to help. So we thought it would be worthwhile today to figure out where we are given this strange time of where we are. Now, when King's College went to our emergency remote teaching mid-March, everybody had to scramble, as many of you have had to do as well. And this statement was included in an email from my department chair. Now, I teach at King's College. It's a Holy Cross school, a brother school to Notre Dame. And one of the things that I love about King's is that there has been a caring culture for decades. So I attended there as an undergrad. I've just come back there in the last 10 years, and I found that that holds true. So this statement in the email really helped me out as I was trying to figure out where I was with things. And so even though if I were with you, I wouldn't be reading any slides to you because some of you may be on your phones, I will quote some of the information that I have here. But our administrator, who by the way was one of my English teachers as an undergrad, and he's a fantastic colleague, said, it might help instructors to know that what matters most right now is not perfection, but an honest effort to provide students with instruction and support animated by compassion. And I so appreciated that when it came because it showed me where I had to place my priorities. And it also reminded me, okay, as a part of King's College, this is what we believe in, and we need to put it into practice. And putting it into practice is not only for students who, of course, have been facing some really challenging situations, but for us as well as we face the challenging situations that we're currently in. So I think about empathy, I think about mindfulness, I think about my intentions. And by the way, I am on this course of learning about compassion, not as an expert, but as somebody who's in a journey, because I want to keep learning for my own self and for my loved ones. So I come as a seeker, and that's where I come from today in terms of talking about this compassion. The Dalai Lama, of course, my good friend, the Dalai Lama, makes this all seem very simple. If you want others to be happy, practice compassion. If you want to be happy, practice compassion. That sounds great, but where does the rubber meet the road? How can I practice compassion and still sleep at night? I find that challenging sometimes. How can I practice compassion and not be a pushover to my students and be taken advantage of or feel like there's not enough rigor? This afternoon, I called the administrator who sent that, who included that note in that email. And I talked to him a little bit about where he was coming from at the time. And we both discussed this point where sometimes we see compassion and rigor and, you know, our academic lives as mutually exclusive. Like either you're going to be rigorous and have tough standards, or you're going to be compassionate. But why can't it be both? Why can't we have academic rigor and our intellect and still practice compassion? So if we think about compassion, I'm highlighting the two elements of it. So on one hand, we have this feeling of deep sorrow for somebody who's in misfortune, for somebody who's suffering. Now, that could also be pity. But what we're talking about here is something different, because this feeling is accompanied by a strong desire to alleviate that suffering. Now, how we alleviate that suffering is different for different people. Some do that through prayer and meditation, and others do that through direct actions that people can see and feel and know. So there's a wide variety in the ways that we can do all of this. Since my work at the Lilly Conference in 2018, some newer research has come out. And there's a great resource if you want to look at this from a scientific perspective, compassion. It's called the Greater Good Science Center at UC Berkeley, and they have some fantastic evidence-based research on compassion. And it seems that the interest in compassion is only growing. So I'm always teaching from an empathic viewpoint. In fact, sometimes empathy I struggle with at times, because first, I never want to assume that I truly know what somebody else is experiencing and feeling. So some of us might be tempted to say, oh, we're all in the same boat here. And I modify that a little bit and say, I can try to understand where you're coming from, but I can't say I ever know that. I'm not going to co-opt that feeling for you. So I think we're all in boats, and the waters keep changing, and we're all having different experiences with that. But it's still worthwhile to think about all of the different perspectives. And so the empathy refers to our ability to take that perspective, but the compassion is when those feelings and thoughts include that desire to help. Like, what do I do about that? How do I make a difference with this? In addition, if you are interested, there's growing literature on compassionate pedagogy. And this journal edition, a whole special edition of the Journal of Perspectives in Applied Academic Practice, came out in December of 2018, focusing on compassionate pedagogy. And I have a link if you want the slides later to access all of the articles. They offer full PDFs of every article in there. Everything from looking at medical professionals and how we are poised to teach with compassion as our students go on to be perhaps medical professionals who we want to be able to apply compassion. Yet, if you think about the perspective about medical school, so many say, no, well, compassion wasn't part of how I experienced being a student. And so that's becoming questioned. So compassionate pedagogy is one angle to go at if you want to think more about compassion in your teaching. And there is a growing body of evidence-based research on this practice. But thinking about how we treat our students and our colleagues with kindness, followed through by actions and practices. And I know this terminology might be challenging, that alleviate suffering and promote well-being. That idea of alleviating people's suffering, I know when I started teaching, I would get so tied up sometimes in wanting to save people, wanting to save students. And I had to really realize where my boundaries were and how I can best serve them, because I can't, and it's something that I have to accept, we all have to accept. We can't just alleviate everybody's suffering, but we can help and we can promote well-being. So I am heartened to find that pedagogy research is considering compassion and looking at it in this way. Now, I find that sometimes I get really compassionate for others, and I don't necessarily show myself that same compassion. And I'm very fortunate that I have very close friends who are kind of like-minded in a sense that we're all on this journey of learning about self-care and self-compassion and, you know, where we are with things. And so a good thing for me is that we check in with each other about these things. So I have a friend who has an animal sanctuary. She runs a complete animal sanctuary, and it's a tough, tough job. And she finds herself really challenged by it. And there are times when I know that she's really stressed out. So one of the best things I can ask her is, what are you doing to take care of yourself? I know you have all this work to do. I know you have this fundraising. I know these animals are sick. I know some animals are dying, but what are you doing to take care of yourself? And if you read about self-compassion, you will see quite often the reference to the instructions for when you're on a flight, that you should put on your own mask before you take care of the others in your care, whether they're children, whether they're partners, loved ones, that you have to preserve yourself in order to do that. Now, sometimes we confuse that with being selfish. No, I'm putting myself first. But research is even starting to show that there's a positive correlation between self-compassion and other kinds of really healthy practices. So on one hand, there's this mindfulness, and I'll suggest to you a way to be mindful about self-compassion, being kind to ourselves, which, by the way, doesn't mean, okay, I'm feeling bad, so I'm going to eat a quart of ice cream. That's not really self-compassion, because self-compassion means watching out for your own health and wanting to be well. So thinking about, well, what can I do that will foster that wellness? And then, of course, just the idea that we're not in it alone. We are not in it alone, that we as human beings are experiencing the world in these ways, and that we can look to each other for resources, and also, I think, just find comfort that, well, it's not just me. If you'd like to read some academic information about self-compassion, Kristen Neff seems to be the foremost researcher in this area right now. And her website is actually called self-compassion, self-hyphenated compassion.org. And on that website, she offers 4 researchers scales for measuring compassion. For instance, there's one scale specifically for use with adolescents. And there are a number of scales on that site. There's a little fun quiz of testing how self-compassionate you are. Trust me, it's far more academic than a BuzzFeed quiz about this. But one of the articles that she shares on her site is about student self-compassion. And it shows that in their study, there's a positive correlation between students who tested well, tested pretty high on self-compassion, with those being the students who are most comfortable being able to talk in class, not being afraid of the judgment of others, that they're kind to themselves, that they say, okay, I'm not perfect, and none of us are perfect, so I'm going to be kind to myself about that. And it really helps them as students. And I'm going to say that same thing can help us as educators. As we all pivoted to this sort of emergency teaching, many of us had this fear of, well, I'm going to look really stupid now. I probably am going to make mistakes. I'm not going to do this well. And, you know, my response to that, because I feel those things as well, and trust me, I make mistakes. I had students texting me saying, we're in a Zoom room, but it says you're in a different Zoom room. Okay, all right, I made a mistake. Oops, thanks for helping me fix it. But showing them that we can be kind to ourselves, we can laugh about it. I don't have to beat myself up about it and lose sleep about it, can model for them how to be kind to themselves as well. And the fact that, you know, we as teachers are always asking our students to stretch and learn and go beyond your limits and what you think you can do. That's what we have been asked to do for the last 6 weeks or so at least, and it will continue. So I think thinking of ourselves as learners is useful here. And Buddhists offer this practice of loving kindness, that if you want a starting point for self-compassion, you can just repeat the following. May I be safe. May I be healthy. May I be happy. May I be at ease. You can then, as you work with that, you can shift it to a particular person or a particular group of people and go to the you form of it. May you be safe. May you be healthy. May you be happy. May you be at ease. And just thinking in those ways, I think, is terrific guidance for the actions that we would like to follow with that. I'm not going to spend too much time on this idea of idiot compassion, but it's actually what led me to want to research this in the first place. About 10 years ago, as I was going through a major shift in life, I was doing some Reiki training, and my Reiki teacher, master teacher, used this term idiot compassion. And I said, uh-oh, I think I'm that. What is that? And it turned out that I had been guilty of what I thought was compassion. Maybe feeling sorry for somebody, but then allowing them to continue bad behavior because I felt sorry for them. But it didn't help that person, and it certainly didn't help me. And I wasn't really being kind. I just wanted to kind of get out of seeing that suffering. So Pema Chodron, who's a Buddhist nun, has some great insights on this practice of idiot compassion. And so it's the fact that you don't always have to be just giving into everything. Wise compassion is really trying to alleviate suffering, but in a way that fosters the health of those you are trying to help, including yourself. The idiot compassion may only cause more suffering. So for instance, it's like codependency. It would be saying, well, I feel so badly for this person who has this addiction, so I'm just going to give in and help them by letting them have a little bit. While you might be alleviating some immediate suffering, you know that you're not helping with the long-term range of things. And so it's worthwhile thinking about, how do I handle situations with students when they come to me, acting in a compassionate way, but also being true to what I'm trying to teach and those values, and doing what's really in their best interest. The danger of all of this compassion, and this may be where some people are hovering right now, is the possibility of compassion fatigue, which some also refer to as compassion distress. The best way to call your attention to it right now is thinking about those who are on the front lines, especially in healthcare, who are overwhelmed by the illness, who are seeing all of the suffering, and who are also experiencing all of those losses. And I know I had seen just in the last few days a story of a doctor who took her own life. And it seemed to be as a result of her experience in trying to treat COVID and trying to save lives. So of course, totally disavowing compassion's not the answer, but then finding this balance and realizing, all right, I have limited capabilities, but what can I do? What can I still do with that? And if you know people or you think you're experiencing this compassion fatigue, there are resources, and many of them are associated with post-traumatic stress. So it's well worth considering that and kind of watching out for, especially in our loved ones. I love Pema Chodron. She's a little challenging to read, but I like her statement that if we learn to open our hearts, anyone, including the people who drive us crazy, could be our teacher. So perhaps you're a faculty developer who's been working massive overtime, and you're finding that you're providing resources and people aren't using them, or they're just complaining about everything. And you're sick of hearing it, and you might be angry and aggravated by it. I would say that first, let yourself be angry without acting on it. Just feel it, process it, and then try to shift over to empathy. So where might this person be coming from? Does this person feel intimidated by the tasks at hand? Do they have situations at home that are currently overwhelming them? We may or may not know that. and then deciding the action. So if I don't feel like acting from compassion, I also know that acting from anger isn't going to help anybody out. We're not going to get better results from that. And so I think it's a decisive course of, despite what I'm getting and my own fatigue, can I make room to react to this person compassionately? And will that more likely help both of us move in the direction that we need to move, especially for where we are right now? So you don't have to be a doormat just because you're compassionate. You can practice wise compassion. We can think about how compassion fits into our daily interactions with students, be they through technology, you know, it's an email, it's a Zoom session, or just in how we design things for students to think and learn about compassion. So I am offering some resources, and I'll show them on the next screen, but my wish for you before we start discussion is to share, may you be happy, may you be healthy, may you be safe, and may you live with ease. So here are some of the resources, just easy lookups. So that Greater Good magazine out of UC Berkeley, a terrific site for resources. On Facebook, there's a Center for Mindful Self-Compassion. They have some terrific images as well. I actually just joined that group recently. You can see scholarly articles on pedagogy, and again, that entire journal issue on compassion pedagogy. So I welcome your insights. I welcome you to teach me a better way, and your questions and feedback.
Oh, thank you, Corine. I really appreciate that. And I love the message, and I love the concepts that you were discussing there. And I think the one for me most, and I'll get to the audience here, just the rest of the group here in a second too, but for me it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to do what everybody wants.
Right,
so,
right.
A neat concept is most people think about, well, show some compassion, give me the opportunity to take this makeup exam, or give me some extra credit, because if you had compassion, you would give me extra credit, or give me extra credit. So
I was having a little trouble getting out of screen share. Sorry about that.
That's fine.
Yeah, but I think that's where people are worried about setting a precedent of, oh, the word's going to get out that I helped somebody, I gave some consideration about this thing. And the compassion doesn't have to be that. It doesn't have to necessarily do with anything with grades or assessments. It could just be the kind words that you share in an email to someone.
Yeah.
A student emailed me yesterday. He's been a little MIA, and I knew him from last semester, so I saw him half of this semester, but my email to him the other day was, I'm concerned about you. Please contact me. And when he did, and he was very specific about, I'm not trying to make excuses, I don't want pity, but he and his girlfriend are living with his grandmother, who's in her 80s and who is high risk. And both of them need to leave the house every day and work and expose themselves in ways to COVID. And then it seems like an unbearable burden, this idea of the potential that them doing that could risk his grandmother's life. And yet there's no other way right now. I have great compassion for that. And so it may not translate into how I grade him, but it certainly fits how I treat him as a human being, and it helps me understand better.
Well, that's great. Well, appreciate that. That's good. Okay, so I want to let everybody know, if you would like, you can, in the question and answer button down at the bottom, if you have questions, you can ask questions. If there are no questions, I'm going to go. I also enabled people's microphones, and so you can unmute yourself and ask a question. And we don't have a massive number of people here, so I think that will work if you have questions. So anyway, let that go. In the meantime, so the one area I do want to ask, well, let me just pause. First of all, any questions? I get excited about these things. It's looking like, I don't see any typing going on right yet. So I'm going to go ahead and ask, and then if anybody has any questions, go ahead and type those in, or you can raise your hand. But the concept, and we did have one person who submitted a question early, so I'm going to kind of broach that topic just a little bit too, but also kind of turn it just a little, is sometimes we want to help people, but they're not the kindest people. And so we'd like to show compassion to individuals, but you know, if I've tried to help somebody and they just complain about things, or they claim I'm not helping them when I really am trying to help them. I mean, what do we do with folks when we, anyway, the reception of our compassion doesn't feel good to us right there?
Yeah, that's a great, a great point. And, you know, those who believe in compassion as a practice, as a consistent practice in their lives, seem pretty consistent also with the idea that everyone deserves it.
Okay.
So you don't have to earn the right to receive compassion. And so the way I look at that, and yes, we're all challenged by it at times, is if I want anything to change in that relationship, especially if there's a negative dynamic, I will try to lead by example.
Okay.
So treating that person with compassion and just being really consistent with it. So I might want to be snippy. I might want to say, stop your crying, stop complaining, you're driving me crazy, but it's not going to get us anywhere. So I may work through that on my own, but then I'm not going to let that translate to how I treat that person. So let's say if I'm in faculty development and I've played that role, do I want that person to come around in the future? Do I want to, for the sake of our students, encourage this person and foster a positive relationship? And it may be that sometimes, we all know curmudgeons. It's a good word. I love the word curmudgeon. We all know people who are like that. And yes, it's a part of their demeanor perhaps. And maybe it's even their shtick. Like, this is how they like to come off. They like to come off to students like that. But what's behind it? And it seems that science is showing us compassion is innate, that we have the capacity. Because I was even searching, you know, are there some people who just seem not to have the capacity? Okay. So it seems that we're born with it. And Todd, your area in psychology can certainly help out with this. We're born with it, but I think we learn and unlearn behaviors based on our experiences. And so I try to look at those situations and think, okay, well, I'm guessing this person doesn't experience compassion very much. And I'm not a therapist, I'm not a psychologist, you know, you could dig deep on those things. But if I just have empathy for that, then again, I might say, well, how can I be consistent to my values and treat this person with compassion anyway?
No, I like that a lot. And I think you've already hit on the other thing that I've often questioned is whether or not the person who is expressing a belief or a feeling is actually aware of their feelings, aware of their beliefs. So right. A faculty member who says, you know, these students are just, they don't even want to learn, so I'm going to go ahead and present my material, but it's not my job to hold their hand, and they come across real curmudgeonly.
Yes.
I often feel like maybe they can't figure out how to work with students, so they take on the persona of not caring.
Yeah,
that makes sense.
And is my, am I being heard? I don't know if you're hearing me.
Hey, is this Connie?
Yeah, it's Connie.
Yeah, yes, you're being heard. Go right ahead.
Okay. Well, I guess what I'm observing is, jumping on what you just said, Todd, is they may have been in this comfortable place, but the current circumstances have forced choices and difficult questions and decisions that they haven't encountered. And so what I'm hearing a lot of is those requests for this. We're saying, I'm getting so many emails, and they're just really burned out. Even the ones who may have this sort of MO of compassion, but on this continuum, there's those who, this is way outside of how they have figured out how to operate. I'm talking about really large classes at a very large institution. I'm not saying they're all curmudgeons. I'm just saying there's that continuum of people worrying that I'm not setting my boundaries and I may be too compassionate. And I think there's that whole other end of suddenly I'm hearing about their families, I'm hearing about their living situation, I'm aware that they don't have food. You know, it's like so much that they just don't even have time to figure out a plan for compassion. They're suddenly confronted with a question that comes in or things that happen. And I think it's really, it's upon us to help be intentional in building in an intentionality about compassion. So as we move into surprise and unexpected things, all kinds of global or local individual things that happen, we have been embedding this mindset, or at least thoughtfulness, reflection, because I think it's the shock of some of it that is very paralyzing, to even swim through it and figure out what options they might have to be compassionate. I think it's really throwing, you know, I have 3 years at small liberal arts and 3 years at large research. So I see the whole spectrum, and I see here how it's very hard to maintain a very distant relationship when they're thrust into these contexts where they're hearing and confronted with so many other things. So I think, and I do this workshop called Caring and Belief in Student Success. And I've been reading on pedagogy of kindness, pedagogy of caring, trying to pull together, keep changing the workshop and trying to build in what are the features and components that would help people be intentional up front as a practice, you know, as a part of course design, and that they aren't, you're not on one hand designing your course and the other hand having feelings of compassion. It all is woven together. So I'm just wondering what you think are the things that might impede people from going down that path of, yes, this is a part of my role as a teacher. This is a part of teaching and learning. It's a part of being humans for some purpose together, whether it's worship things or family things or academic things. It's a component of how we choose to be.
So I really like that. Corine, I want you to answer this, what Connie's just brought up, which I really like. But I also heard, Connie, in your statement, is kind of like that once you open up the floodgates, there's a lot of faculty out there who don't actually feel, you don't really get the sense that they have a lot of compassion, at least the way they express themselves. But when someone does, the students can start flocking. And if you've got 400 students and they all start emailing and they all start contacting you, it's hard to take care of yourself. So I guess maybe based on what Connie just said for Corine there, that concept of how do you broach the topic, but then also maintain some boundaries.
Yeah, these questions are things that actually led me to do more research on it, because I found myself, especially in my earlier years of teaching, wanting to save everybody, or having situations where there were certain students, like, I need to save them. What can I do? First of all, I am not a savior, you know? Okay. And so I have to know the boundaries, the limits of what I can do. So an example of that, it was about 8 or 9 years ago here in our area, there was flooding. So we had evacuated, the school had evacuated. We were off for about a week. Luckily, my home, which was flooded to the second floor in 1972, was fine when we came back. Right. But my first question to students when we returned is everybody okay? How is everybody? And there was one student who, his home was flooded. Mom and younger siblings moved in with her boyfriend. Not a good relationship with dad. He had nowhere to go. He had muddy sneakers on, the clothes on his back, and his laptop. Wow. And so here I am. First, I'm speechless, right? And then I think, oh my God, what am I going to do? Of course, we have to have our basic needs met before we could think about higher learning. So this is where I had to find, okay, here I am at King's College. So I took the students' information. I said, listen, I'm going to get back to you as soon today as I can. And I went to our advisement office and they said, well, why don't you go talk to campus ministry? Long story short, by that afternoon, one of the priests had taken this young man shopping for clothes.
Wow.
They put him in a residence hall and on a meal plan. Now, it's an extreme case, but it leads me to this idea of we're not alone. Like, I can't save people by myself. I wasn't going to bring him home to live with me and my son, right? And there are those kinds of issues. But then think about our community. What kinds of resources do we have? This isn't all on me. So in a similar way, if a student shares with me that they're struggling with depression, that they're struggling with mental health issues, I can't save that person, but I can advocate for that person to go to our counseling center and use those resources. I will offer to walk that person to the counseling center. If that person's in my office, I will say, do you want me to dial the phone for you? And those things do make a difference. But I think it's about finding those boundaries and using the resources and realizing that we are not saviors. We can't do it all. I had a student who was essentially, she was terrified to go into an arranged marriage. It was supposed to be the summer between freshman and sophomore year. And she was physically sick from it. I wanted to bring her to my house and hide her. But I had to know better that that's not my role, that's not my boundaries. But I was able to advocate for her to use the resources, which led her in some fantastic ways. But I had to stop myself from saying, oh, Corine, you can save everybody. You can save her.
Which is back to your other point. I mean, the real compassion is hooking a person up with the resources, not trying to do something that you're not personally trained to do. So I think that's great. And that does bring up another point that I've long believed is a really, if for everyone on the call and anyone listening later, if you don't know where the resources are, it's really worth just a short period of time when you can get back on campus. We're going to get back there eventually to our campuses. But to say to a student, we have a fabulous counseling center and I'd love to, I recommend you go there. Let me see if I can figure out where it's at. It starts to change the tone from, we have a great counseling center, let me walk you over there, or let me tell you exactly how to find them. So just finding those resources for students ahead of time, I think is great. So,
yeah.
Well, thank you for answering that one. Because of the sake of time here, we've got another question on there, and we've only got a couple of minutes left because we stop at 8:45. So can you see the question there, Corine?
Yeah, how can we show compassion to others without hurting others' feelings or dignity? And it's really interesting. I guess I hadn't thought about it in that way. And I'm guessing, and is this Sarah? Sarah, feel free to jump in. We don't want to make them feel like they are lesser than because they, need help or are receivers of our compassion. I think it's, if I'm understanding it correctly, it's
Sarah can't jump, right? I can't have Sarah. Sarah, I tried to do the allow to talk button, but you're running an older version of Zoom, so it won't let me do it.
Okay. I think it's about, do we have sound?
No, it's.
No, okay. For me, it's about how I would communicate the compassion. And I'll be honest, I don't have a terrific answer for this, but when I'm interested in helping somebody in a compassionate way, I will kind of tell them where I'm coming from and say, hey, maybe I misunderstand your situation, but if I kind of make it more about me and my understanding of their situation versus you are an object of pity who needs my help, I think it's a way to handle it.
Yeah. No, I think that's true too. And I would just say that I think talking to a person about the process of help is often helpful, which I think you've already done before. But
right,
for a student, oftentimes you got students who, what study I read out of Daytona Community College, 11% of university students and 22% of community college students have not eaten as much as they would like to have eaten within the past 72 hours because of money. They just didn't have enough money.
Yep.
And if you say to somebody, oh my goodness, I see you don't have enough money to eat, here's some food, that can that's probably not the best scenario for somebody's dignity. But when you can say, hey, I happen to have 2 sandwiches I've packed and I'm only going to eat one of them. If you would like the other one, that's fine. Everybody, everybody forgets their food from time to time. There's ways of helping people without making them feel bad, but you do have to work at it, I believe. So.
Right. And I think it goes to that individual. How well do you know that person that you sent, how they're going to perceive the offer of help? One of my closest friends to this day who was an undergrad with me, one of the consistent stories she tells about her experience at King's was a professor saying to her, when's the last time you ate? Mm-hmm. And let's just, you know what, I was going to go over to the cafeteria. Why don't you come over with me and we can talk and eat, because I'm going to eat anyway.
Yeah.
And for that person who was short on money, from a big family, first generation college, that made all the difference. And 26 years later, she's still telling the story.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
Well, we're down to 2 minutes, and we have Rebecca had typed in on the Q&A one.
Uh-huh.
And it was, I'm interested in research related to compassion around university policies. A campus is maintaining, yes, Rebecca, the campus that has the rigid rules and stuff. This is, of course, a campus can't do anything. These are individuals who have authority of a campus who are making these decisions. But yeah, so, if you're on a campus that's just got so here's what I'm going to do, Rebecca, is I'm going to try to reframe this a little. And I totally understand what you're saying, and I totally get, because I've been on campuses where this gets so frustrating. But instead of a nasty campus climate, I would take this as a campus that believes that that rigorous standards have to be there, or they've somehow let academic integrity out the window. So what do you do if we got overly aggressive academic integrity going on here, Corine?
Yeah, I still think it's a both and. You can have rigor and you could have compassion in how you treat people. There is a terrific article about the University of Virginia that focuses on the university climate surrounding compassion.
Oh.
And so it's in that special edition of the journal that I mentioned in the presentation. And again, I can share the link for all of those things for those who are interested. But it's the Journal of, well, I'd have to switch to my slides, but it's applied science. And so one of those articles about the University of Virginia, you will see is very campus oriented. So it's looking at it in a holistic, in a really large way. But I still do think your point, Todd, that human beings are what make up a college and a university, right?
Yeah, and I always find it fascinating when people say my campus is, my campus, the campus policies we have are terrible policies. It's like, okay, well, what you're saying is the president, the provost, the deans have set policies that you aren't consistent with. So it is, but it's really challenging, and it's tough. So
and I'm guessing that policies hurt retention.
Yeah, and everybody has a culture. There's cultures and climates everywhere. And I will just say, Rebecca, because you're on the call here too, is I have been in campus cultures that I don't feel matched really well with what my culture was. And those places were ones where I had to work really hard and try to figure things out. And that's where it's tricky, because it is like swimming upstream. But I do have one I want to mention quickly as a faculty member I had when I was an undergraduate, and I was working with him, and I was complaining about the students who just wouldn't work, and these students wouldn't work. And he finally said to me, he said, I'm going to let you complain about that 3 times. And then you either have to start to change it or just shut up, because he says, you're going to drive yourself crazy. Yep. And so he was being compassionate in a way of telling me to stop complaining. So sometimes the way this twists, I find it just fascinating. But I think that's the tricky spot. And Rebecca's brought up a good one, is it's a hard row to hoe, and you just kind of got to keep picking at it and pointing out what you said, Corine. I like this, is looking at the policies, looking at ways we can help people. But yeah.
Right. And thinking about our self-compassion. And I try to put it this way, and I even say this to my son sometimes. Would you, if someone were treating your best friend the way you're treating yourself, wouldn't you want better for that person? So then why aren't you being better to yourself?
You know, it's funny you should say that, and we're going to have to wrap in a minute, but this was getting so exciting and fun, is I work with a group of early career physicians, and I asked them to spread themselves across the room. This was back when we could all be together, on a scale of 1 to 10, to the extent to which you feel like you're good at negotiating. And ones were way on one side of the room, and that's terrible at negotiating. As soon as you start talking, you just give up everything. And tens where you're like master negotiators. And they all arrange themselves, 16, they all arrange themselves between like a 2 and a 6. And then I said, okay, now imagine you're advocating or negotiating for something for a patient. And they all shifted over about 4 notches.
Thank God.
Well, but this is the funny part is, what's the different strategy? What are the actual different skills of negotiating for a patient versus negotiating for yourself, except you hold yourself in less regard? So it's what you had just said is, if we're going to be compassionate, we have to help others, but we also have to realize that we ourselves deserve this compassion as well.
Absolutely.
Like that. Well, I'm going to wrap up there, and thank you for the folks who had the questions and listening in, and those of you who join us later through a recording. But Corine, thank you so much for helping us with this, and I'm hopeful if people have questions, they can always ask you a quick question later or email you maybe.
Absolutely, I appreciate that. This has been fun. Thanks for letting me dive back into this area and think more about it. I think it'll be summer research for me.
Excellent. Well, thank you all for joining. I'm going to say
thanks, everybody.
Thanks have a great evening, and hope to see you again maybe next week. So thank you for coming.
Take care.
Thank you, Todd and Corine.
Thank you.
You're welcome.